That is the first thing investigators noticed when they arrived at the scene at 6:15 in the morning on July 31st, 2022, in Strongsville, Ohio. A Toyota Camry had gone into a brick wall at the end of a dead-end street in a corporate business park. The car was unrecognizable. The wall had a hole in it. 2 young men were dead inside the vehicle. The driver was unconscious and had to be cut out of the wreckage with rescue tools, but there were no skid marks. No evidence that the driver had ever tried to stop. And when one of the first officers on scene called it in, his voice said something that the dispatch recording preserved. Oh my God, ×3, guys. This is bad, guys. 3 people in a car that had been traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour when it hit a solid brick wall in a business park at 6 in the morning. One of them was still alive. What looked like a terrible accident on a quiet Ohio street in the early morning hours became something else entirely when investigators started watching the surveillance footage. And once they watched it, the question of what happened inside that car and why never went away. This is 911 crime. Every source used in this video is linked in the description below. Check it yourself. That is how this channel works. Before we go into the footage and the investigation, I want to tell you about the 2 people who did not walk away from that wall, because they are the reason every single word in this video matters. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. His friends called him Dom. He was the kind of person who showed up at parties, at family dinners, in the lives of the people he loved. His friends described him as doting, easygoing, the kind of guy who would stroke his girlfriend's hair while she fell asleep on the couch. He was interested in music. He talked about starting a clothing line. He tracked stocks and cryptocurrency. He was 20 years old with ideas about where his life was going. Just hours before the crash, he sent a message to his father. 3 words, "Love you, Dad." That message was the last thing Dominic Russo ever sent to anyone. Davion Flanagan was 19. He had been adopted at age 8 by Scott and Jamie Flanagan. After a difficult start in his biological family, he graduated from Strongsville High School in 2022 and had been a standout football player until injuries ended his college prospects. After that, he had been thinking about barber school. He kept showing up for the people in his life, even when things got hard. Friends remembered him as goofy, genuine, and easy to be around. He was 19 years old and figuring out the next chapter. Both of them were dead before sunrise on July 31st, 2022. They were in a car that someone drove into a wall at 100 miles per hour and never once tried to stop. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old on the morning of July 31st. She had been in a relationship with Dominic Russo for roughly 4 years since she was 13 and he was 16. That timeline matters. By the time of the crash, they had recently moved in together after Mackenzie graduated from Strongsville High School. On the surface, they were a couple moving into the next phase of their lives together. But the relationship, according to testimony and records that emerged during the investigation, was not stable. It was described as volatile. There were documented incidents, threatening messages, a threat to key his car, an attempt to break a door handle off his home after he refused to let her in. Friends described their dynamic as intense in ways that made people uncomfortable. The relationship that looked like a love story from the outside had edges that people close to it knew about and didn't always talk about. On the night of July 30th and into the early morning of July 31st, the 3 of them attended a graduation gathering at a friend's house. Witnesses described the atmosphere as calm. There was no argument, no visible tension. A friend named Rosie Graham described watching Dominic stroke Mackenzie's hair as she fell asleep on the couch around 3 in the morning. There was not one argument, she said. There was not one moment of tension. There was not one bad vibe towards anybody. They left the gathering around 5:30 in the morning. Mackenzie was driving. Dominic was in the front passenger seat. Davion was in the back. What happened next is documented on surveillance footage, and the footage does not lie. The car turned onto a street in the Progress Drive Business Park in Strongsville. It is a dead-end road. There is no reason to drive fast on it. There is nothing at the end of it except a brick building. The surveillance camera captured what happened next in full. The car accelerated. It did not drift or lose control in the way a vehicle does when a driver is distracted or impaired. It accelerated deliberately. The speed climbed past 60, past 70, past 80, past 90. The camera recorded the car reaching close to 100 miles per hour as it moved toward the building at the end of the road. And then it hit no braking, no swerving, no attempt to avoid the wall. Full throttle, straight into the brick at 100 miles per hour. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were killed on impact. Mackenzie Shirilla was unconscious in the driver's seat. Officers used rescue tools to extract her from the wreckage. She was airlifted to a hospital where she underwent multiple surgeries. For the first 3 months after the crash, investigators treated it as a potential accident. The initial assumption was impaired driving. They had found marijuana and THC in the systems of all three. It was early morning. Maybe something had gone wrong medically. Maybe she had lost control. But the surveillance footage made the accident theory difficult to hold. Full acceleration into a dead-end wall with no brake input is not the signature of a driver who lost control. It is the signature of a driver who had a destination and drove toward it. And then investigators found the AP. Dominic's friends came to the police station voluntarily in the days after the crash. They brought their phones. They showed investigators the data from Life 360, a location-sharing app. The data showed exactly where Dominic's phone had been in the final minutes of his life. It showed the speed of the car as it moved through the business park, and it showed the moment of impact with a precision that surveillance cameras could only approximate. There's no hard braking until, it will show you when they hard brake, one of Dominic's friends told an officer. And that was when they hit the wall. Read that again. The only hard braking the app recorded was the physical impact of the car hitting the building. There was no braking before it. Not a single moment when the driver applied the brakes before the wall. The app data, combined with the surveillance footage, combined with the physical evidence at the scene, no skid marks, no evidence of evasive action, no mechanical failure in the vehicle, began to shift the shape of the investigation from accident to intention. Investigators started looking at the relationship more closely. They interviewed Mackenzie's ex-boyfriend. They pulled text messages. They looked at the documented incidents, the threats, the property damage, the volatility. They built a picture of a relationship in which control and conflict had been part of the pattern for a long time. And they started to ask a question that is very difficult to ask about a 17-year-old girl who had just come out of surgery. Did she do this on purpose? On November 4th, 2022, 3 months after the crash, investigators had their answer. A detective drove to where Mackenzie Shirilla was staying. He placed her in handcuffs, and what was captured on his body camera in the moments that followed became one of the most analyzed pieces of footage in the entire case. "Hi, Mackenzie. Step out for me," the detective said. "I'm the one who's been investigating the crash. You're under arrest for aggravated murder, ×2, and Mackenzie Shirilla's response to being told she was under arrest for the murder of her boyfriend and his friend was to ask the officer, through tears, to be careful, removing her jewelry so it didn't break the bracelet. Investigators and prosecutors who reviewed that footage described it as one of the clearest demonstrations of misplaced priority they had seen. 2 people were dead. She was being arrested for killing them, and her immediate concern in that moment was her bracelet. Prosecutors cited that footage alongside dozens of other pieces of evidence as they built the case. The prosecution's argument was direct. Mackenzie Shirilla intentionally drove that car into that wall to end her relationship with Dominic Russo. Davion Flanagan, according to prosecutors, was simply in the wrong seat on the wrong night. The defense argued that there was no way to determine intent from the evidence. They pointed to the mutually volatile nature of the relationship, suggesting that it was impossible to know what had happened in the final moments before the crash. They argued that the crash could have been the result of impaired driving or a sudden medical episode. And they argued that a 17-year-old girl should not be tried as an adult for something that could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt to be premeditated murder. The judge disagreed on every point, Mackenzie Shirilla waived her right to a jury trial and elected to have her case decided by a judge. That judge was the Honorable Nancy Margaret Russo, no relation to Dominic Russo, of the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. On August 14, 2023, Judge Russo delivered her verdict and her reasoning from the bench, and the words she used became among the most quoted in this case. She morphs from a responsible driver to literal hell on wheels as she makes her way down the street. She had a mission, and she executed it with precision. This was not reckless driving. Judge Russo found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty on all 12 counts, 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, 1 count of possessing criminal tools. Guilty on every single charge. At sentencing, Mackenzie Shirilla stood before the court and said, "I'm so deeply sorry. I would never let this happen or do it on purpose." She said she was not a monster. She said she was the driver of a tragedy, not a murderer. Her parents stood by her. They said they would not stop fighting. They said they believed she had been falsely accused. Judge Russo sentenced her to 15 years to life in prison on 2 concurrent terms. In an act the judge herself described as an act of mercy, she ordered the sentences to run at the same time rather than consecutively, which would have meant a minimum of 30 years before any parole eligibility. As it stands, Mackenzie Shirilla's first parole hearing is scheduled for September 2037. She was 17 years old on the morning she drove that car into that wall. She will be in her early 30s before anyone formally considers releasing her. What followed the conviction was a legal fight that has now produced multiple failed appeals and, most recently, a decision that borders on the surreal. Mackenzie's legal team filed a post-conviction appeal in October 2024. The Ohio 8th District Court of Appeals denied it, not because the legal arguments lacked merit, but because the petition had been filed 1 day past the 365-day statutory deadline. 1 day. The defense argued that the clock should not have started until the juvenile hearing transcripts were filed. The court disagreed. The defense also argued that 2024 was a leap year and that the extra day should have given them an additional 24 hours. The court disagreed with that too. In May 2025, the Supreme Court of Ohio declined to review the appeal. In March 2026, the 8th District affirmed the denial of the 2024 petition. Every door the legal team has tried to open has closed, and then, in May 2026, Netflix released a documentary called The Crash, and the case came back to national attention with a force that no court filing had managed to produce. The documentary includes surveillance footage, body cam recordings from first responders and from the arrest, cell phone records, text messages, courtroom footage, and interviews with the families and friends of all 3 people in the car that night. It also includes something that nothing in the case file had contained before. Mackenzie Shirilla's voice in a formal interview, speaking for the first time since the verdict about what she says happened. "I just know myself," she said in the interview, conducted with her attorney present. "And I know I'm not a monster," she did not confess. She did not change her account. She maintained that she did not intend to kill anyone, and her words, delivered calmly from a prison interview room, landed differently on people who had followed the case than on people who were encountering it for the first time through the documentary's framing. Because that is the thing about this case. That makes it so difficult to look away from. The surveillance footage is not ambiguous. The app data is not ambiguous. The judge's findings were not ambiguous. And yet a person who was 17 years old, who survived the crash that killed 2 people she knew, who has been in prison since 2023, sat down in front of a camera and said the same thing she has always said: "I did not do this on purpose." The families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan have been living in a very different kind of silence. Dominic's father received the last message, "Love you, Dad," a few hours before his son was killed. Davion's adoptive parents, who had taken him in at age 8 and watched him grow into the young man who had been planning his next chapter, have had to absorb the reality that the next chapter never came. They know what the footage shows. They know what the app data showed. They know what Judge Russo said from the bench. And they know that the person who drove that car is still alive, still talking, and still saying she is not a monster. What the documentary does, perhaps unintentionally, is put both of those realities in the same frame at the same time. The footage that shows what the car did. The voice that says she didn't mean for it to happen. And the viewer is left to hold both of those things and decide what to do with them. Investigators had a phrase for what they believed happened in the Progress Drive Business Park at 6 in the morning on July 31st, 2022. They did not call it an accident. They did not call it a tragedy. They called it a mission executed with precision by a driver who had been building toward something for 4 years and chose a dead-end road in a business park on a summer morning to end it. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. Davion Flanagan was 19. They were dead before the sun was fully up. There were no skid marks at the scene, and the only hard braking the app ever recorded was the moment the wall stopped the car. Mackenzie Shirilla is currently incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio. She is 21 years old. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for September 2037. The documentary is streaming on Netflix right now. The families are still waiting for a version of justice that a court can deliver, but grief cannot. Every verified fact, every confirmed source used in this video is in the description below. Check it, share it. This is 911 Crime.